My boyfriend and I dated for 7 years. I paid his rent, funded his startup, and sacrificed my 20s for his dream. He suddenly announced his wedding at a Michelin star restaurant, but I was not the bride. As I walked away, he texted me to never contact him again. I calmly replied, "Okay." He had absolutely no idea that by the very next morning, his entire fake empire would collapse, starting with his multi-million-dollar penthouse. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to destroy a partner who used you and threw you away. Do not make a scene. He hissed, his fingers digging uncomfortably into my skin. Kinsley's parents are in there, and they do not need to deal with your working-class drama tonight. You are embarrassing me in front of the most important people in this city. Preston sat frozen in his leather chair, completely destroyed. His breathing was ragged and shallow. He looked wildly around the room for any sign of support, but the other executives simply looked away in disgust. In less than 24 hours, he had lost his luxury penthouse, his extravagant wedding venue, his multi-million-dollar career, and his entire professional reputation. He was officially unemployed, completely radioactive in the commercial real estate industry, and entirely dependent on Kinsley's family wealth to survive. The towering empire he thought he built was nothing but dust blown away by the very woman he had called a charity project. I left the Sterling Group headquarters through the private executive elevator. I did not wait to watch security march Preston out the front doors, holding a cardboard box. The financial slaughter was complete, and my analytical mind was already shifting focus to the remaining loose ends. My private driver was waiting at the curb to take me home. Not to a cramped apartment or a depressing working-class flat, but to my actual residence. A stunning multi-million-dollar modern townhouse located in the heart of the Gold Coast. The property was a fortress of quiet luxury. It featured an imported limestone facade and interior courtyard with a heated infinity pool and a 3-story floating glass staircase that rivaled the one in my corporate lobby. Preston had never seen this house. Whenever he insisted on maintaining the illusion of being my provider, I let him keep me contained in his leased penthouse. It was easier to audit his failing businesses while he thought I had nowhere else to go. I had barely poured myself a glass of sparkling water and settled onto my custom Italian sofa when the heavy brass knocker on my front door began pounding furiously. The sheer violence of the knocking echoed through the high ceilings of the entryway. I checked the security monitors built into the kitchen island. Standing on my front step, vibrating with unrestrained rage, was Preston's older sister, Vanessa. Standing quietly behind her, looking deeply uncomfortable, was her husband, Isaiah. I pressed the button to unlock the magnetic deadbolt and opened the heavy oak door. Vanessa did not wait for an invitation. She shoved her way past me, her designer heels sinking into my imported rugs. Her face was twisted into an ugly snarl, a perfect mirror image of her mother, Beatrice. "You vindictive, psychopathic snake!" Vanessa screamed, her voice shrill and completely devoid of any basic social grace. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" My mother called me in absolute hysterics. "Preston just got fired. He lost his job, he lost his equity, and the firm is threatening him with a federal investigation. You set him up." I closed the front door slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on her. "I did not set him up, Vanessa. I simply presented the exact financial records he submitted to a purchasing committee. He chose to commit wire fraud all on his own." "You hacked their system," Vanessa shrieked, pacing wildly across my living room. "You hacked his portfolio and altered the numbers because you are a jealous, bitter ex-girlfriend. You knew he was moving on to a better life with Kinsley and you could not stand it. You are a pathetic working-class nobody who decided to frame a successful man just to drag him down to your miserable level." Isaiah stepped into the entryway, softly closing the heavy door behind him. He did not immediately join his wife in her screaming match. As a highly trained structural architect, he was doing what he did best. He was looking at the structure. His sharp eyes scanned the massive open-concept living space. He took in the museum-quality artwork hanging on the limestone walls, the custom architectural lighting, and the absolute perfection of the interior design. He was running the numbers in his head, calculating the astronomical cost of the property we were standing in. "You really believe the lies Beatrice feeds you," I said, taking a step toward Vanessa. "You believe Preston was a real estate genius supporting a helpless accountant. Let me correct your flawed math. I audited his fake assets. I bought out his defaulted loans. I own the corporate entity that evicted him from his wedding venue this morning. He built his entire fragile ego on my capital, and the second I pulled my funding, he collapsed." I looked down at his hand, gripping my arm until he slowly let go. "You just announced your engagement to another woman on our 7-year anniversary, Preston," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I think you handled the embarrassing part all on your own." Vanessa's face flushed a violent crimson. She was completely immune to logic, blinded by a lifetime of family entitlement. "Shut your mouth," she roared. "You are lying. You are a complete fraud." She lunged forward, raising her hand high to strike me across the face. I did not even flinch. Before her hand could connect with my cheek, Isaiah moved with terrifying speed. He stepped between us, his large hand snapping out to intercept his wife's wrist mid-air. His grip was absolute. "Stop it, Vanessa," Isaiah commanded, his deep voice vibrating with an authority that instantly silenced her screaming. He slowly forced her arm down his dark eyes, burning with a mixture of anger and profound disappointment. "Look around you, Vanessa. Just open your eyes and look at this house." Vanessa struggled against his grip, looking wildly around the immaculate living space as if seeing it for the first time. "What does this have to do with anything?" "She rented some fancy house to make herself look important." Isaiah shook his head, releasing her wrist with a look of pure disgust. "She did not rent this. I know this property. I studied these exact blueprints when the architectural firm won an award for this renovation 3 years ago. This is a primary residence owned by Vanguard Apex Capital." He turned to look directly at me, the pieces of the puzzle finally locking together in his brilliant mind. He remembered seeing me in the lobby of the Vanguard building earlier that day. He remembered the absolute authority in my voice when I told Preston to leave my property. "She did not frame him, Vanessa," Isaiah said, his voice dropping to a harsh, cold whisper. "She did not hack any files, and she did not lie to anyone. Preston has been lying to us for 7 years. He is a fraud. He has been bleeding her dry to play the part of a tycoon, and she finally decided to stop paying for his costume." Vanessa stood completely frozen, her mouth opening and closing as the reality of her brother's pathetic existence finally began to crack through her delusions. Isaiah did not give her time to launch into another phase of denial. He gripped her firmly by the elbow and began marching her toward the heavy front door. "I am deeply sorry for this intrusion, Paige," Isaiah said, his voice entirely sincere as he dragged his kicking, protesting wife across the imported rugs. "You have my absolute respect. You did what had to be done." He pulled the oak door open, shoving Vanessa out onto the front step. Before he followed her into the cool evening air, Isaiah paused. He looked back at me over his shoulder, making sure Vanessa was out of earshot. He leaned back into the doorway, lowering his voice so only I could hear the devastating piece of intelligence he was about to deliver. "Preston is desperate," Paige, Isaiah whispered. "He was completely panicked about his finances even before you canceled the wedding venue. He went behind his firm's back yesterday to secure emergency cash. He used the deed to his penthouse to secure a massive short-term bridge loan directly from Kinsley's father." Isaiah gave me one final respectful nod before pulling the door firmly shut behind him. The lock engaged with a heavy, satisfying click. I stood alone in the absolute quiet of my massive living room. The information Isaiah just handed me was explosive. A slow, deadly smile spread across my face as I walked toward my secure home office. My eyes lit up with the thrill of the final calculation. Preston did not actually own the deed to that penthouse. I owned the promissory note through Vanguard Apex, and I had officially initiated the foreclosure protocol 12 hours ago. "I am moving up in the world, Paige," he shot back, puffing out his chest. "I need a wife who belongs in these circles. Kinsley's family has real money. They have connections. They own half the commercial real estate in this city. She does not sit in a depressing cubicle crunching numbers all day like you do. I am building a legacy that you could never understand. You are building a lie, I replied without blinking. Preston had just used a foreclosed property he did not own to fraudulently secure a private loan from his billionaire future father-in-law. The federal wire fraud at his corporate firm was going to destroy his career, but stealing directly from Kinsley's powerful, unforgiving family was going to destroy his actual life. I sat down at my desk and opened my encrypted laptop. It was time to make sure Kinsley's father received a highly confidential audit of his new future son-in-law's assets. Let us see how the high society elite handled being scammed by the very trash they swore to keep out of their social circles. The Vance family estate sat behind massive iron gates in the ultra-exclusive neighborhood of Lake Forest. It was a sprawling stone mansion deliberately designed to project centuries of inherited wealth and absolute power. Preston paced frantically across the imported Persian rug, in the mahogany-lined study, his breathing ragged and shallow. The oppressive silence of the old money estate was suffocating. Beatrice sat stiffly on a tufted velvet armchair, her posture rigidly defensive. She aggressively smoothed the skirt of her designer dress, desperately trying to maintain her composure. Stop pacing, Preston. You are projecting weakness. Warren is a businessman. We simply pitched this disaster as a strategic corporate restructuring. Preston ran a trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair. I was just fired, Mother. I was literally escorted out of the building by armed security guards. The Sterling Group is legally distancing themselves from me. Kinsley is currently screaming in the guest house because her dream wedding venue was canceled out of nowhere. We need cash immediately to secure a new location and keep my creditors quiet before Kinsley realizes I'm completely broke. The heavy oak doors swung open with a resounding thud. Warren Vance stepped into the study. He wore a tailored tweed jacket and carried a crystal glass of bourbon exuding absolute arrogance. He looked down his nose at Beatrice and Preston, his expression twisting into a mask of pure distaste. Warren projected the image of vast unlimited wealth, but in reality, he was a faux billionaire who relied heavily on aggressive leverage and intimidation to maintain his social standing. I do not appreciate being ambushed in my own home, Warren stated, his voice a low, threatening rumble. Especially by a man who just triggered a hysterical meltdown from my daughter. What exactly happened with the Chicago Botanical Estate, Preston? And why did my associates at the Sterling Group just inform me that you were forcefully removed from their corporate headquarters? Preston swallowed hard, fighting to keep his voice steady. It is a temporary setback, Warren. A corporate misunderstanding. I am officially leaving the firm to launch my own independent commercial real estate fund. The venue cancellation was a clerical error by a jealous rival firm. I have everything entirely under control. Beatrice stood up, flashing a sickly sweet, desperate smile. Preston is simply evolving, Warren. Just as you did when you built your magnificent empire. We are here because Preston needs a minor short-term liquidity bridge to ensure Kinsley gets the flawless wedding she deserves while he transitions his massive assets. Warren sneered, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. A liquidity bridge? Is that the working-class term for begging? You come into my home smelling of cheap panic and ask for a handout. I built my fortune on ruthless acquisitions, Beatrice. I did not build it by writing blank checks to reckless boys who cannot even secure a basic wedding venue without getting evicted. Preston sneered, adjusting his expensive tie with a look of pure arrogance. Get your cheap clothes out of my penthouse by 8 a.m. tomorrow. I paid for that lifestyle. You are just a guest in my home and your welcome has officially worn out. Do not make me call building security to throw you out on the street. He was completely blinded by his own towering ego and his desperate need for high society approval. He genuinely believed that he held all the power in this dynamic. He had no idea what was coming. Preston stepped forward, his eyes wide with raw desperation. $2 million, Warren. That is all I need to cover a premium new venue, the vendors, and the immediate operational costs for my new firm. You will get it back with 20% interest the second my pending deals close. We are practically family. Warren stared at Preston, his eyes cold and calculating. He understood perfectly that his daughter's social standing relied entirely on the illusion of perfection. If the Chicago elite discovered Kinsley was marrying a bankrupt, unemployed fraud, the Vance family reputation would be permanently damaged. He had to bail this pathetic man out just to protect his own aesthetic. "I will give you the 2 million," Warren finally said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "I will do it solely to keep my daughter happy and to prevent our family name from becoming a punchline at the country club. But I do not do handshake deals with unemployed men." Warren walked behind his massive oak desk and pulled a thick leather-bound folio from the top drawer. He slapped it down onto the polished wood. "I require ironclad collateral. You want my money to save your pathetic lifestyle, you give me absolute security." Anything, Preston agreed, instantly, practically salivating at the promise of a $2 million lifeline. "Name your terms, Warren." "The deed to your luxury penthouse in the Gold Coast," Warren demanded, dropping a heavy gold pen onto the desk. "My attorneys have already drafted the security agreement. You sign the property over as collateral today. If you default on this bridge loan by a single day, or if you embarrass my daughter again, I take the property. I take the penthouse and I throw you out on the street." Beatrice gasped loudly, clutching her pearls in genuine shock. "Warren, that is his primary residence. The penthouse is his crowning achievement. You cannot ask for his home." "Those are my terms," Beatrice Warren snapped coldly. "Take the 2 million and sign the collateral agreement, or walk out my front door right now and explain to Kinsley why her wedding is cancelled and her fiancé is broke." Preston did not even hesitate. His extreme narcissism completely blinded him to the reality of his own financial disaster. He believed he was a master manipulator. He assumed the penthouse was completely safe to use as collateral because he had simply ignored the late payment notices from his original mortgage lender for 36 months. In his highly delusional mind, the bank was just a slow bureaucratic machine that he could easily outsmart once he had Warren's $2 million securely in his bank account. "The penthouse is fully clear, Warren." Preston lied flawlessly, stepping up to the desk and picking up the gold pen. "It is worth 5 million on the open market. You have my absolute word that the title is unencumbered." Preston pressed the pen to the heavy parchment paper. He signed his name with a flourishing, arrogant stroke, completely convinced he had just saved his fake tycoon lifestyle. He had secured the cash, appeased his ruthless future father-in-law, and salvaged his precious wedding. Warren picked up the signed contract, a predatory, victorious smile stretching across his face. "Excellent. The funds will be wired to your account within the hour. Do not make me regret this, Preston." Right as Warren spoke the final word, a sharp buzzing sound cut through the tense silence of the study. Preston reached into his tailored pocket and pulled out his phone. A high-priority automated email had just bypassed his spam filters and landed directly in his primary inbox. Preston looked down at the bright screen. The sender was his original mortgage servicer. The subject line read in bold, unforgiving letters, "Notice of transfer of lien and immediate foreclosure." The ride from the restaurant back to the penthouse took exactly 14 minutes. I spent every second of it calculating. Not crying over a wasted 7-year relationship, but running the numbers in my head, like the forensic data analyst I am. Preston thought he had just discarded a useless piece of working-class baggage, a girl he no longer needed. He had no idea he had just triggered an avalanche. Preston's breathing stopped entirely. He opened the email, his eyes frantically scanning the single devastating paragraph. The original lender had officially sold the defaulted promissory note on his luxury penthouse. The debt was now owned entirely by Vanguard Apex Capital. The multi-million-dollar property he had just legally signed over to Warren Vance as collateral no longer belonged to him. Preston stared at the glowing screen of his phone, his thumb hovering over the glaring text. His mind, conditioned by years of extreme narcissism and unchecked privilege, simply refused to accept the mathematical reality staring back at him. He blinked rapidly, his breathing hitched, and then he did exactly what he always did when faced with his own failures. He swiped the notification away. "It is a glitch," he muttered under his breath, sliding the heavy phone back into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. "A simple bureaucratic error. Some low-level clerk at the bank hit the wrong button. I will have it cleared up by tomorrow morning." He turned back to Warren and Beatrice, forcing a brilliant, perfectly manufactured smile onto his face. "The deal is done, Warren. Thank you for your partnership. I look forward to finalizing the venue today." He practically sprinted out of the sprawling Vance estate, eager to escape the suffocating presence of true wealth. He drove straight to a high-end boutique cafe in the city to meet Kinsley, slapping down his one remaining credit card to buy her a lavish, overpriced lunch. He poured her a glass of sparkling rosé and confidently declared that her father had recognized his sheer business genius and happily provided the liquidity bridge. He spun a beautiful, totally fabricated narrative about his booming independent firm. He spent the entire afternoon playing the part of the triumphant tycoon, completely suppressing the ticking time bomb sitting in his inbox. But Warren Vance did not amass his fortune by trusting the arrogant smiles of unemployed men. He was a shark who survived by verifying every single claim. The moment Preston's car cleared the estate gates, Warren made a single phone call. He dispatched his most ruthless private appraiser and title inspector to physically evaluate the Gold Coast penthouse and pull the official municipal property records. Across the city, sitting in my secure downtown office, I was already watching the trap spring shut. I do not rely on luck. I rely on flawless execution. At precisely 8 in the morning, my legal team had submitted the finalized lien transfer documents directly to the county clerk's office. I had paid an exorbitant expedition fee to ensure the public registry was updated the very second the municipal doors opened. The digital ink on the county database was barely dry when Warren's inspector logged into the system. The appraiser stood in the marble lobby of Preston's luxury building, holding a freshly printed, legally binding title report. He did not even need to ride the private elevator up to the penthouse to evaluate the imported fixtures or the panoramic views. The paper in his hands told the entire devastating story. The document clearly outlined a massive, catastrophic defaulted lien. It showed exactly 36 months of missed mortgage payments. It showed late fees, severe penalties, and an insurmountable mountain of debt. And right at the top, it listed Vanguard Apex Capital as the sole exclusive holder of the promissory note with immediate rights to foreclose. Preston owned absolutely nothing. He had zero equity in the property. He was essentially a very well-dressed squatter living in a multi-million-dollar glass box on borrowed time. The appraiser immediately scanned the damning public records and forwarded them directly to Warren's secure private email server with a red flag for high importance. Preston was mid-sentence boasting to Kinsley about the custom floral arrangements they were going to order for their new wedding venue when his phone rang. The caller ID flashed Warren's name. Preston smirked, assuming his future father-in-law was calling to confirm the $2 million wire transfer had cleared. He answered the call with a slick, confident greeting. "You fraudulent, pathetic piece of garbage!" Warren's voice boomed through the receiver. The sheer volume and absolute rage in the older man's voice made Preston physically flinch. Preston's smile vanished instantly. "Warren, what is going on? Is there an issue with the wire transfer?" I unlocked the heavy mahogany door of the $1.5 million Chicago penthouse. The space was a monument to his massive ego. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glittering skyline. Italian leather furniture filled the living room. Abstract art hung on the walls, carefully curated to look expensive. Preston loved to tell his high society friends that he bought this place entirely with his own hard work and business acumen. He loved to play the role of the real estate tycoon. "Do not play games with me!" Warren roared, his voice, a low, terrifying growl of pure menace. "My inspector just pulled the municipal title report on your penthouse. You tried to hand me a property that is carrying a massive defaulted lien. You have zero equity. You do not even own the deed anymore. Some holding company is actively foreclosing on you. You looked me directly in the eye and tried to use a worthless, toxic asset to con me out of $2 million. Warren, please, you have to listen to me." Preston stammered, his heart hammering against his ribs as sheer panic finally shattered his delusion. "It is a mistake. It is just a massive bureaucratic error. My old bank made a clerical mistake in their system. The title is clear. I swear to you, I can fix this. You have exactly until the end of the business day to clear this supposed error." Warren snapped, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. "If you do not provide me with a pristine, legally binding title report showing you hold 100% clear equity by 5 o'clock today, the loan is permanently revoked. Furthermore, the wedding will be completely canceled. I will personally ensure you are blacklisted from every single country club, bank, and social circle in this state. If you embarrass my family with your financial incompetence, I will ruin you." The line went dead. Preston lowered the phone, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the device into his untouched lunch. The color had completely drained from his face. Kinsley was staring at him, her brow furrowed in confusion, asking what her father had said. Preston could not even form the words to respond. He abruptly stood up, making a desperate excuse about a corporate emergency, and practically ran out of the cafe, leaving Kinsley sitting alone at the table. He sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel as hyperventilation set in. He could no longer swipe the notification away. The denial was gone, replaced by a suffocating, terrifying reality. He pulled his phone back out and opened the automated email he had ignored earlier that morning. He stared at the bold letters detailing the transfer of his lien to Vanguard Apex Capital. He had to fix this. He had to use his charm, his aggressive negotiation tactics, and his sheer willpower to force this holding company to reverse the error before 5 o'clock. With trembling fingers, Preston dialed the corporate contact number listed at the bottom of the email, completely unaware of exactly who was sitting in the corner office waiting for his call. The flashing red light on my encrypted office console indicated an incoming call on the priority dispute line. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, a slow smile forming on my face. I pressed the intercom button, instructing my executive assistant Sarah to intercept the call while keeping the audio feed live in my office. A sharp click echoed through the speaker, followed instantly by Preston's voice. He was practically hyperventilating, his tone a frantic mixture of manufactured authority and raw terror. He aggressively demanded to speak to whoever was in charge of Vanguard Apex Capital, shouting that a catastrophic clerical error had frozen his assets. He threatened massive lawsuits and claimed his high-powered legal team would destroy the company by nightfall. Sarah remained impeccably calm, a perfect reflection of my own calculated demeanor. She used the exact script I had meticulously prepared for her. She politely informed him that the primary shareholder of Vanguard Apex only handled high-level property disputes during formal in-person meetings. She offered him an immediate appointment to resolve the issue. Preston scoffed loudly, the sound vibrating with unearned arrogance. He declared he was entirely too busy managing a multi-million-dollar real estate transition to drive downtown for a bottom-tier bureaucratic mistake. He demanded the lien be erased immediately over the phone. When Sarah simply reiterated the policy, Preston slammed the phone down. His hubris was a beautifully predictable variable. Preston was currently trapped in a prison of his own making, desperate to secure a premium wedding venue and convince Kinsley that his financial empire was still thriving. Acknowledging a defaulted lien meant admitting failure, which his fragile ego simply could not process. Instead of handling his own impending ruin, he outsourced the problem to his mother. Beatrice was more than willing to act as his corporate enforcer. She had spent decades perfecting the art of intimidating service workers and browbeating anyone she deemed beneath her elevated social class. In their deeply flawed delusional logic, Vanguard Apex was just some desperate small-time creditor trying to squeeze a few pennies out of a wealthy family. They truly believed their sheer presence and a few empty legal threats would instantly force this holding company to back down. Less than an hour later, the private elevator chimed on the executive floor of the Vanguard building. Beatrice marched into my reception area like a conquering queen demanding tribute. She wore an absurdly ostentatious fur coat and carried a designer handbag that cost more than most people earned in a year. I sat back in my corner office watching the high-definition security feed broadcast directly to my desktop monitor. Beatrice aggressively slammed her hand down on Sarah's polished glass desk. She demanded to see the managing director immediately, loudly claiming she was there to resolve a fraudulent claim against her son's luxury estate. The truth was entirely different. Sarah maintained her professional, icy smile. She politely asked Beatrice to take a seat in the waiting lounge while she checked the director's availability. That simple standard request was entirely unacceptable to a woman who had never been told no. Beatrice launched into a spectacular, shrill tantrum. She shrieked about how her family was intricately connected to the powerful Vance dynasty, how her son was a rapidly ascending real estate tycoon, and how she absolutely refused to be kept waiting by a glorified secretary. Sarah simply folded her hands and reiterated that the director was currently unavailable and waiting was mandatory. Beatrice's face flushed a violent crimson. She was completely unequipped to handle someone who did not instantly cower at her demands. She snatched her handbag off the desk, loudly declaring that she would not waste another second in this pathetic amateur operation. I sipped my espresso, watching with deep satisfaction as she stormed back into the elevator, her heels clicking aggressively against the imported marble floor. She had completely failed to realize she had just walked away from the only person on earth who could save her son from absolute ruin. The second the elevator doors closed, Beatrice pulled out her phone. I knew exactly what she was telling Preston. She was furiously reporting that Vanguard Apex was a total joke, a fraudulent scam company running out of a rented office space with an incompetent receptionist. She commanded him to completely ignore their emails and notices. She confidently assured him that their imaginary family lawyers would easily crush this fake holding company by the end of the week. Preston, desperate for any excuse to maintain his flawless facade, took her terrible advice. He chose to ignore the blaring warning signs and went back to pretending he was a billionaire for Kinsley. His absolute failure to investigate the situation was the final nail in their collective coffin. By storming out of my office, Beatrice had formally rejected my offer to negotiate. By ignoring the problem, Preston had legally waived his final mandatory grace period. He was too busy spinning desperate lies for Warren Vance to realize he had just handed me the exact legal leverage I required to annihilate him. I picked up my phone and dialed my lead real estate attorney. I gave him a single definitive command: execute the filing immediately. Within 20 minutes, my elite legal team was standing inside the county clerk's office. They formally filed the notice of default and intent to foreclose against Preston's Gold Coast penthouse. This was not a polite warning or a negotiable corporate request. This was a binding, irreversible municipal mandate. The filing officially triggered a heavily accelerated 48-hour countdown. Preston had completely ignored the final warning, and now the legal mechanism was entirely unstoppable. In exactly 2 days, the county sheriff would arrive at the luxury penthouse with a signed court order. They would physically seize the multi-million-dollar property, remove every single piece of furniture, and permanently change the locks. Preston was currently sitting in a high-end restaurant sipping expensive sparkling water, desperately trying to save a fraudulent wedding, completely unaware that his absolute ruin was now officially ticking down by the second. The 48-hour countdown was officially ticking down to 0. Preston was living on borrowed time, completely unaware that his beloved luxury penthouse was about to be seized by the county sheriff. I sat in my office systematically reviewing the foreclosure documents when my private courier delivered a heavy cream-colored envelope with garish gold foil lettering. It was an invitation to Kinsley Vance's elite bridal shower at the ultra-exclusive Oak Brook Country Club. Kinsley was remarkably predictable. Her fragile ego demanded an audience for her perceived victory. She maliciously invited me because she wanted the pathetic working-class ex-girlfriend to witness her grand triumph. She wanted to publicly humiliate me in front of Chicago's high society, completely oblivious to the fact that she was marrying an unemployed fraud who was currently facing financial ruin. IRSVP'd yes immediately. I was not going to miss the opportunity to watch her pristine illusion shatter. The following Saturday, I pulled my private car into the circular driveway of the Oak Brook Country Club. The valets rushed forward to open my door. I bypassed the crowded lobby and walked directly toward the private Astor dining room. Kinsley had transformed the elegant historic space into a spectacularly tacky display of new money excess. Massive walls of imported pink orchids choked the room. A towering ice sculpture of a diamond engagement ring dripped onto the imported linen tablecloths. Waiters circulated with silver trays of vintage champagne and overpriced caviar. It was a desperate, aggressive attempt to project unlimited wealth. I walked into the master bedroom and pulled a single black duffel bag from the closet. While Preston was busy playing the big shot developer buying tailored suits and leasing a sports car he could not afford, I was the one working nonstop to keep us afloat. I audited merger and acquisition data for some of the biggest financial firms in the country. I ate ramen noodles and wore clearance rack clothes so I could pay the electricity bill, the water bill, and the grocery bills every single month. I subsidized his extravagant life while he built his empire. I arrived exactly 45 minutes late. I did not wear flashy designer logos or aggressively tailored branded dresses. I wore a bespoke emerald green silk suit paired with simple vintage diamond studs that cost more than Kinsley's entire floral budget. My appearance was a masterclass in quiet, absolute power. I did not need to scream for attention because I owned the room the second I crossed the threshold. The loud chatter of 50 high society women died instantly as I walked through the double doors. Every head turned to stare. Kinsley was sitting at the head of the main table draped in a heavily branded couture dress that looked incredibly cheap against the elegant backdrop of the country club. When she saw me, her spray-tanned face lit up with a razor-sharp, malicious smile. She practically leaped out of her chair and marched across the room, holding her champagne flute high. She wanted to make a scene. "Paige, I am absolutely shocked you actually showed up," Kinsley announced, her voice pitched loudly so every woman in the room could hear her condescension. "I assumed you would be too depressed sitting in your cramped little apartment to celebrate my happiness. It must be incredibly difficult for you to watch Preston upgrade to a real life with a woman from his own social class. But please grab a cheap party favor on your way out." Several of her sycophantic friends giggled behind their crystal glasses. They expected me to shrink to cry or to storm out in a fit of jealous rage. I did not even blink. I stood my ground, radiating an icy, untouchable calm. I slowly looked Kinsley up and down, letting my silence drag out until her triumphant smile began to physically waver. I stepped directly into her personal space. The scent of her overpowering, expensive perfume filled the air between us. I leaned in close, keeping my voice dropped to a perfectly modulated whisper so that only she could hear the absolute destruction I was about to deliver. "Have you checked your father's offshore trust accounts lately, Kinsley?" I whispered, my tone devoid of any emotion. Kinsley froze. Her eyes darted back and forth, entirely confused by the question. "What are you talking about?" she hissed under her breath. I smiled, a cold, predatory curve of my lips. "When your father wired Preston $2 million for your precious wedding venue, my forensic accounting team traced the routing numbers. Warren has been hiding his capital in illegal shell companies for a decade. I simply forwarded his exact transaction history to the federal authorities. It is incredibly hard to fund a lavish high society wedding when your father's entire financial empire is frozen by the IRS. The champagne flute in Kinsley's hand shook violently. The blood drained completely from her face, leaving her looking sickly and hollow. The malicious arrogance vanished from her eyes, instantly replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. She opened her mouth to speak, to call me a liar, but the absolute certainty in my voice paralyzed her. She knew her father was a ruthless, shady businessman. She knew the money was always heavily leveraged. "Enjoy the party, Kinsley," I said smoothly, stepping back and speaking at a normal volume. "It is going to be a very memorable weekend." I turned my back on her and walked calmly out of the Astor dining room. I did not rush. I did not look back. I left 50 wealthy women staring in complete confusion at the bride-to-be who was now trembling uncontrollably in the center of the room. Kinsley did not care about her guests anymore. She dropped her crystal glass onto a cocktail table and sprinted out the side doors onto the country club patio. Her hands were shaking so severely she could barely unlock her phone screen. She bypassed Preston entirely. She did not care about her fiancé. She immediately pulled up her contacts and dialed the direct private line to her father's senior wealth manager. It was a highly secure number that the Vance family had relied on for 10 years to manage their vast, heavily guarded fortunes. I packed my few modest belongings: 5 plain business suits, a handful of sweaters, a few pairs of sensible shoes. It took me less than 20 minutes to completely erase my entire physical existence from his life. I left behind his expensive watches, his designer shoes, and the illusion of his immense wealth. Kinsley pressed the phone to her ear, her breathing shallow and erratic. She waited for the familiar, reassuring ringtone of the elite banking firm. Instead, a sterile automated voice echoed through the speaker. "The number you have reached has been disconnected or is no longer in service." Kinsley stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the stone patio. She dropped her phone. The device clattered against the ground, the screen cracking instantly. The seed of absolute panic had just blossomed into a full-blown nightmare. Her wedding was falling apart. Her fiancé was a fraud, and her billionaire father was currently facing a federal raid. The ultimate financial slaughter was finally underway, and I had orchestrated every single move. While Kinsley's artificial world crumbled on the country club patio, a different kind of reckoning was taking place across the city. Isaiah could not let the encounter at my townhouse go. He was a man of structure, logic, and mathematics. The numbers Preston presented to the family simply did not align with the reality Isaiah had witnessed in my living room. The imported limestone facade, the floating glass staircase, and the sheer, unadulterated power in my voice had planted a seed of doubt that his analytical mind could not ignore. Sitting in his sleek glass-walled architectural office, Isaiah logged into the secure municipal property database. As a senior structural architect, pulling deeds, zoning permits, and historical property ledgers was an integral part of his daily routine. He navigated past the basic residential search portals and went directly to the heavily encrypted county clerk records. He typed in the exact address of Preston's Gold Coast penthouse. The screen quickly populated with a complex timeline of ownership liens and financial transfers. Isaiah adjusted his glasses, his dark eyes scanning the dense columns of legal text. He found the original mortgage document from 5 years ago. It was exactly as Preston had boasted, a premium luxury property secured with a massive high-interest loan. But as Isaiah tracked the payment history forward, the illusion of Preston's wealth completely shattered. 3 years ago, the payments stopped entirely. The ledger showed a catastrophic cascade of late fees, severe penalties, and a formal notice of default. Preston had not simply fallen behind on a few bills. He had completely abandoned his financial obligations. The original bank had initiated aggressive foreclosure protocols to seize the asset, but the property was never repossessed. Instead, Isaiah found a formal transfer of lien. The toxic debt had not been forgiven. It had been purchased in its entirety by a private holding company, Vanguard Apex Capital. Isaiah sat back in his ergonomic chair, the breath rushing from his lungs as the realization hit him. Vanguard Apex was my company. The pieces locked together in his brilliant mind with terrifying clarity. I had not hacked Preston's corporate files or framed him for wire fraud. I had been his silent savior. For 36 months, I had deliberately absorbed his catastrophic debt. I had paid for the literal roof over his head, shielding him from absolute ruin and funding his lavish faux billionaire lifestyle while he paraded around the city pretending to be a self-made tycoon. Preston was nothing but a parasite, bleeding my capital dry to fund his fragile ego. Isaiah hit the print button. The heavy commercial printer hummed to life, spitting out 20 pages of irrefutable, legally binding truth. He gathered the warm papers, shoved them into his leather briefcase, and walked out of his office. He did not call Vanessa to warn her. He drove directly to Beatrice's immaculate suburban estate. I stood in the center of the living room and looked around one last time. 3 years ago, Preston had nearly lost it all. He had secretly gambled his company's funds on cryptocurrency investments and highly speculative commercial flips that completely failed. He went bankrupt. The bank was actively preparing to seize this very penthouse. He had cried on this Italian leather sofa, begging the universe for a miracle. Beatrice and Vanessa were sitting in the sunlit conservatory, sipping imported bergamot tea and aggressively planning their outfits for Kinsley's upcoming wedding. They were deeply immersed in their shared delusions of grandeur, happily discussing how Preston's marriage into the powerful Vance family would permanently elevate their own social status in the city. Isaiah bypassed the housekeeper and walked straight into the conservatory. He did not offer a polite greeting. He unclasped his briefcase and slammed the thick stack of municipal property records directly onto the glass coffee table, the sharp crack shattering their peaceful afternoon. "What on earth is this?" Isaiah Beatrice demanded, her face twisting into a mask of aristocratic annoyance. You are projecting negative energy into my home. Isaiah ignored her complaint. He pointed a sharp finger at the top document. That is the objective reality of your son's existence, Beatrice. I pulled the municipal title for the Gold Coast penthouse, the property you have been bragging about to your country club friends for 5 years. Vanessa set her teacup down, her brow furrowed in confusion. Preston's penthouse. What does that have to do with anything? He does not own it, Isaiah stated, his deep voice devoid of any warmth. He defaulted on the mortgage 3 years ago. The bank was going to throw him out on the street. He was completely bankrupt. Beatrice scoffed, waving a dismissive hand in the air. That is a ridiculous lie. Preston is a financial genius. He probably restructured the asset for corporate tax purposes. You architects simply do not understand high-level finance. Isaiah leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the glass table, refusing to let her escape the truth. He did not restructure anything. He failed. And do you know who saved him? Do you know who bought his defaulted debt and quietly paid for his luxury lifestyle for 36 months? Neither woman answered. They simply stared at him in stunned silence. Paige, Isaiah said, delivering the name like a physical blow. Vanguard Apex Capital is her holding company. She bought the lien. She kept a roof over his head. She funded this entire family while you continuously mocked her for being a working-class nobody. Isaiah straightened his posture, looking down at his wife and his mother-in-law with absolute unfiltered disgust. She wasn't the gold digger. Preston was. Paige funded this entire family. The conservatory descended into a suffocating, heavy silence. The irrefutable truth sat right in front of them, printed on official county letterhead. A normal, rational family would have felt intense shame. They would have realized the magnitude of their cruelty and the depth of Preston's deception. But the Wilson family was entirely immune to logic. Beatrice's face flushed a violent, ugly shade of crimson. Her eyes bulged with irrational fury. She absolutely refused to let her perfect narrative collapse. She reached across the table, grabbed the stack of municipal documents, and violently ripped them in half. "These are lies!" Beatrice shrieked, throwing the torn papers onto the imported rug. "Fabricated nonsense generated by a bitter, jealous ex-girlfriend. Preston is marrying Kinsley Warren, has millions. We don't need that little accountant." Vanessa immediately nodded in fervent agreement, clinging desperately to her mother's delusion. Exactly. Preston is about to inherit a massive empire. Paige is just trying to ruin his happiness because she knows she will never belong in our world. Isaiah stood perfectly still, watching the torn pieces of reality flutter to the floor. He looked at his wife, seeing the sheer, unadulterated madness in her eyes. He looked at Beatrice, whose entire existence was built on a foundation of aggressive denial. They were completely untethered from reality, willingly blinding themselves to the financial slaughter that was currently tearing their family apart. My name is Paige, and I am 27 years old. I work as a forensic data analyst, specializing in mergers and acquisitions right here in Chicago. The crystal chandelier light fractured through my champagne glass as I stood in the private dining room of an exclusive downtown restaurant. 50 of Chicago's elite mingled around me, their designer clothes and expensive watches flashing in the ambient light. I was wearing a simple silk dress I had saved up for, bought specifically for tonight. Preston and I had been together for exactly 7 years today. After months of him dropping subtle hints and secretive smiles, tonight was supposed to be the night he finally proposed. I gave him that miracle, but I did not do it by handing him a check. I am an accountant. I deal in contracts, equity, and leverage. I dragged my duffel bag to the front door, locked it behind me, and took the private elevator down to the lobby. The night air was freezing as I stepped out onto the Chicago sidewalk. A black rideshare vehicle pulled up immediately. I threw my bag into the trunk and slid into the back seat, giving the driver the address to a nearby hotel. He slowly shook his head, a profound sense of finality settling over him. He realized in that exact moment that Beatrice and Vanessa were completely beyond saving. They were going to go down with Preston's sinking ship, happily drinking tea while the water rose above their heads. Isaiah turned his back on them and walked out of the conservatory without saying another word. While Isaiah walked away from his fracturing marriage, I was sitting at the head of a sprawling mahogany conference table in my secure downtown office. My entire legal team flanked me, their laptops open, projecting complex financial models onto the glass monitors mounted on the wall. We were not just reviewing standard foreclosure procedures. We were executing a flawlessly timed financial guillotine. 3 years ago, when Preston initially faced absolute bankruptcy, he had desperately restructured his mortgage into a highly toxic, privately held commercial note to avoid a very public, humiliating residential foreclosure. That specific type of predatory loan came with a brutal, unavoidable catch: a balloon payment, a massive multi-million-dollar lump sum due at the very exact end of the loan term. That term had expired exactly 48 hours ago. Preston had known this catastrophic payment was coming for years. He had arrogantly assumed he could simply refinance the debt or charm another corporate bank into extending his credit lines. But his credit was entirely radioactive. He had one final, desperate chance to scrape together the liquidity to cover the balloon payment, but his unchecked narcissism had completely blinded him. Instead of saving himself, he took the last remaining capital he could leverage and blew it entirely on a flawless 6-carat diamond engagement ring for Kinsley Vance. He literally bought the shiny instrument of his own destruction, prioritizing an illusion of wealth over his actual survival. My lead counsel, a sharp, aggressive corporate litigator named Harrison, tapped his gold pen against the glass table. He smiled a predatory smile, pointing directly to the highlighted statute on the projection screen. Under strict Illinois commercial property law, missing a balloon payment on a privately held investment note completely strips the debtor of all standard residential protections. It completely bypasses the usual 90-day grace periods, the endless court appeals, and the bureaucratic red tape. It allows the private lien holder to trigger an immediate, highly accelerated foreclosure and seizure process. There were no loopholes. There were no extensions. I held the note, I held the power, and Preston's clock had officially run out. Across town, inside the glass walls of the Gold Coast luxury penthouse he no longer owned, Preston was standing in front of a full-length mirror, adjusting the lapels of his bespoke velvet tuxedo. He was preparing for his extravagant rehearsal dinner, entirely convinced he was about to permanently cement his place in Chicago high society. He was eagerly anticipating the moment Warren Vance formally welcomed him into the billionaire class, completely unaware that his future father-in-law's accounts had just been frozen by federal agents. The private elevator chimed, echoing through the marble foyer. Preston's personal concierge stepped out, holding a thick, heavy envelope secured with bright red certified tape. The courier respectfully approached, explaining that the parcel required a direct physical signature. Preston rolled his eyes, visibly annoyed by the interruption to his grooming routine. He snatched the digital pad from the concierge, aggressively scribbled his signature without reading the authorization screen, and grabbed the thick envelope. He glanced down at the return address printed in the corner: Vanguard Apex Capital. As the car pulled away from the curb, my phone vibrated inside my purse. I pulled it out. The screen lit up with a message from Preston. "I paid for that lifestyle. Do not contact me again. We are done." A vicious sneer curled his lips. In his deeply delusional mind, fueled by his mother's terrible advice, this was just another desperate attempt by a low-level, incompetent debt collector to harass a wealthy man. He did not even bother breaking the heavy seal. He walked directly into the custom chef's kitchen, a kitchen I had quietly paid for over the last 36 months, and tossed the unopened, legally binding notice of accelerated seizure straight into the stainless steel trash can. He checked his reflection one last time, grabbed his keys, and confidently rode the elevator down to the lobby. He had absolutely no idea that he had just legally acknowledged receipt of his own immediate eviction. He was rushing off to his lavish party, two blind frauds marching happily toward the exact same devastating cliff. Back in my boardroom, a sharp notification chimed on Harrison's secure tablet. He looked down, his professional demeanor giving way to a wide, deeply satisfied grin. He slid the tablet across the polished mahogany table toward me. The digital delivery receipt glowed bright green on the high-definition screen. It displayed Preston's hurried, sloppy signature. The strict legal requirement for physical service had been officially fulfilled. He had accepted the document. His arrogant refusal to read its contents was no longer my problem. The steel trap was permanently locked. I reached into my tailored jacket and pulled out a silver fountain pen. Harrison placed the final decisive document directly in front of me. The writ of execution. This was the absolute end of the line. A county judge had already reviewed the accelerated commercial default earlier that morning and granted the immediate seizure order based on the missed balloon payment. All the mandate required was my formal authorizing signature as the primary shareholder of Vanguard Apex Capital. I sat in the quiet boardroom staring at the stark black ink on the heavy legal paper. I thought about the years I spent silently paying for that luxury penthouse while Preston and Beatrice viciously mocked my clothes, my career, and my working-class upbringing. I thought about the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of a man who genuinely believed he could abuse people without consequence simply because he wore an expensive suit and drove a European car. I did not feel angry. I did not feel bitter. I felt absolute icy resolution. I pressed the silver nib to the paper and signed my name with a fluid, commanding stroke. I capped the pen and slid the executed writ back to Harrison. I stood up from the conference table, smoothing the lapels of my dark suit, feeling the full weight of my power settle over me. Have the county sheriff meet us at the Oak Brook Country Club at exactly 8 o'clock tonight. I instructed my legal team, my voice echoing with quiet, terrifying authority. It is time to crash a party. The Oak Brook Country Club's grand ballroom was bathed in the warm, golden glow of thousands of imported crystal chandeliers. The space had been transformed into an obscenely lavish monument to new money and manufactured prestige. Towers of white roses and imported hydrangeas cascaded from the ceiling, while a massive custom-carved ice sculpture of two intertwined swans dominated the center of the room. Dozens of Chicago's social elite sat at tables draped in heavy silk dining on perfectly seared Wagyu beef and drinking vintage champagne. It was a flawless, pristine illusion of limitless wealth. At the head table, Preston stood up and confidently tapped a silver spoon against his crystal flute. The gentle ringing sound brought the room to a polite hush. He adjusted the lapels of his custom velvet tuxedo, projecting the absolute certainty of a man who believed he owned the world. He flashed a brilliant, highly practiced smile at the crowd of wealthy investors, socialites, and his own beaming mother Beatrice, who was sitting in the front row wiping away theatrical tears of pride. I stared at the glowing screen. A small, cold smile formed on my lips. The sheer audacity of his delusion was impressive. He had convinced himself of his own lies so thoroughly that he believed he was the provider. He believed he was the king of the castle, dismissing the peasant girl who was no longer fit for his court. He had Kinsley now, Kinsley with her fake old money aesthetic and her family's supposed real estate dynasty. He thought he had traded up. Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate the merging of two great families. Preston announced, his voice smooth and dripping with unearned arrogance. They say that behind every great man is an even greater woman. For years, I poured my entire soul into building my real estate empire from the ground up. I sacrificed, I strategized, and I conquered the market. But I always felt like a crucial piece of the puzzle was missing. Then I met Kinsley. I finally found a woman who matches my ambition, a woman who understands the sheer velocity of success. Together, we are not just going to build a life. We are going to build a dynasty. The room erupted in polite, wealthy applause. Beatrice dabbed her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, turning to the woman next to her to loudly boast about her son's staggering financial genius. Preston raised his glass to Kinsley, playing the role of the triumphant self-made billionaire to absolute perfection. But sitting directly beside him, Kinsley Vance looked like she was attending a funeral. She did not smile at his sickeningly sweet speech. She did not raise her glass to meet his. She sat rigidly in her heavily beaded designer gown, her skin an alarming sickly shade of chalk white. She was clutching her silk napkin so tightly her knuckles had turned completely pale. My whispered warning from the bridal shower was playing on an endless, terrifying loop inside her head. She had spent the entire afternoon frantically trying to log into her father's various offshore trust accounts. Every single portal had locked her out. Every single wealth manager she tried to call had either ignored her or answered with disconnected lines. The absolute panic had set in, hollowing her out from the inside. To her immediate right, her father, Warren Vance, was faring even worse. Warren was a ruthless, predatory shark in the financial sector, a man who survived by intimidating everyone around him. But tonight, he was sweating profusely through his bespoke Italian suit. He was not listening to a single word of Preston's narcissistic speech. He was staring down at his encrypted smartphone, hiding the screen beneath the edge of the table. His thumb aggressively swiped across the glass, sending rapid-fire panicked messages to his shadow lenders and crisis management attorneys. Warren had just discovered the catastrophic truth. The IRS had not simply audited him. They had executed a massive, highly coordinated freeze on his entire financial network. His domestic accounts, his offshore trusts, his shell companies, everything was completely locked down. He had zero liquidity. He was currently bleeding capital at a terrifying rate, and his heavily leveraged empire was literally hours away from a total, highly public collapse. He needed hard physical assets to secure emergency bridge loans to keep himself out of federal prison, and he needed them immediately. As the applause died down and the string quartet resumed playing in the corner of the ballroom, Preston stepped away from the head table to fetch another glass of champagne. He walked confidently toward the massive ice sculpture, admiring his own reflection in the mirrored wall behind the bar. He did not see Warren approaching until the older man forcefully grabbed him by the elbow. Warren's grip was like an iron vice. He physically dragged Preston behind the towering ice sculpture, completely shielding them from the view of the dining room. The friendly, welcoming mask of the future father-in-law vanished instantly. Warren's face was a mask of pure, desperate menace. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and utterly devoid of mercy. "Warren, what is going on?" Preston asked, flashing his slick, practiced smile, though a hint of nervous confusion bled into his voice. The speech went well, did it not? "Shut your mouth and listen to me, Warren!" hissed his voice, a low, terrifying growl that made Preston physically recoil. Warren reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored jacket and yanked out a tightly folded, densely worded legal document. He slapped it flat against the top of the frozen bar right next to the ice sculpture. "I did not send a paragraph of rage. I did not demand an explanation or call him names. I simply typed a 4-letter response. Okay." I hit send and immediately blocked his number. Then I reached into my tote bag and pulled out my encrypted work laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated the dark back seat of the car. I opened my secure browser and navigated to a private financial portal. The login screen displayed a simple, unassuming logo: Vanguard Apex Capital. "This is a formal collateral transfer agreement," Warren stated, tapping his heavy gold ring against the paper. "You owe me $2 million for the venue and the wedding vendors. I need the liquidity back immediately. Since you claim your cash is tied up in commercial acquisitions, I am taking your hard assets instead." Preston's confident smile completely collapsed. "Warren, we have an agreement. The wire transfer was a family loan. You said I had 6 months to liquidize my secondary assets. The terms have changed." Warren snarled, leaning in so close Preston could smell the stale whiskey on his breath. "You boast about your multi-million-dollar Gold Coast penthouse. You claim it is fully paid off. Sign the deed over to me as collateral right now. My lawyers will leverage it by tomorrow morning. Once you pay me back the $2 million in cash, I will return the deed to you." "Warren, I cannot just sign over my primary residence at a rehearsal dinner," Preston stammered, his heart hammering violently against his ribs, as sheer panic finally breached his delusion. "It is highly irregular. My lawyers need to review this." Warren grabbed Preston by the lapels of his velvet tuxedo, yanking him forward. "I do not care about your lawyers. I do not care about what is regular. You sign the penthouse over to me right now, or the wedding is permanently off. I will walk out there, announce to every high society family in Chicago that you are a fraud. and I will destroy your reputation before the dessert is served. Choose. Preston was entirely trapped. His mind raced frantically. If he refused, Warren would ruin him instantly, and he would lose Kinsley and his access to the Vance fortune. If he signed it, he was handing over a property he technically no longer owned, as he had ignored the default notices. But his unchecked narcissism took over. He genuinely believed his mother's advice. He believed Vanguard Apex was a fake company, and the foreclosure threats were empty. He convinced himself he could sign the document to placate Warren tonight and tie the paperwork up in endless litigation on Monday morning. "Fine," Preston muttered, his hands shaking slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. "You are being completely irrational, Warren, but if this is what it takes to prove my commitment to your daughter, I will sign it." Preston uncaps the pen. He leans over the frozen bar, his hand hovering over the signature line. The gold nib of the fountain pen presses into the thick legal paper, leaving a tiny dark drop of ink. At that exact precise second, the massive heavy oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung open with a violent echoing thud. The heavy wooden doors slammed against the walls, creating a sound like a gunshot. The string quartet stopped playing instantly. The lively chatter of the wealthy guests died in their throats. 50 heads whipped around in unison to stare at the entrance. I stepped into the ballroom perfectly framed by the grand entryway. I wore a sharp-tailored black trench coat over my emerald suit, projecting an aura of absolute, unyielding authority. I did not come alone. I was flanked by 2 fully uniformed county sheriffs, their hands resting firmly on their utility belts. Directly beside them stood a county process server, holding a thick, legally binding stack of heavily stamped court orders. It was time to crash a party. The silence that followed my entrance was absolute. The string quartet musicians froze with their bows hovering awkwardly above their instruments. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes and silver forks ceased instantly. 50 of Chicago's most elite socialites turned their heads in perfect unison, their eyes wide with scandalized delight. The atmosphere of manufactured prestige evaporated the very second the heavy oak doors slammed against the walls. Beatrice was the first to break the silence. She scrambled backward, her dining chair tipping over and hitting the floor with a sharp crack. Her face twisted into a mask of purple, unhinged rage. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. This was my anonymous, limited liability company. No one knew I owned it, not my coworkers, not Preston, and certainly not his mother Beatrice. I typed in my credentials, bypassed the 2-factor authentication, and accessed the dashboard. "Security, get this obsessed stalker out of here. She's ruining my son's night." Beatrice shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceilings. "This is a private event? How dare you let this trash in here?" "She is a pathetic, jealous ex-girlfriend who cannot accept that my son upgraded." A country club manager in a tailored suit hurriedly stepped out from the shadows, eager to appease his wealthy clientele. He moved toward me with his hand outstretched, but he did not make it far. The lead sheriff simply turned his head and rested a hand casually on his utility belt. The manager instantly retreated, his face draining of color. No one was going to interfere with a court-mandated execution. Law enforcement presence immediately shut down any possibility of physical removal. I did not flinch. I did not acknowledge Beatrice's hysterical screaming. I kept my eyes locked directly on the head table. I walked straight down the center aisle of the Astor dining room. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels against the polished marble floor sounded like a metronome ticking down the final seconds of Preston's fake life. The sea of wealthy guests pulled their chairs in parting like the Red Sea to let me pass. They whispered furiously behind their hands, captivated by the dramatic intrusion. I glanced briefly at the head table as I approached. Warren Vance was completely frozen, gripping the edge of the linen tablecloth. A sheen of cold sweat coated his forehead. For a terrifying second, Warren genuinely believed the uniformed officers were federal agents coming to arrest him for his frozen offshore accounts. He shrank back into his chair, entirely consumed by his own impending ruin, completely abandoning his future son-in-law. Beside him, Kinsley was hyperventilating. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, remembering the devastating warning I had whispered to her at the bridal shower. Neither of them cared about Preston. They were drowning in their own panic. Preston finally emerged from behind the melting swan ice sculpture. He stepped right into the center of the room to block my path. He puffed out his chest aggressively, smoothing the velvet lapels of his tuxedo, trying desperately to project dominant alpha male energy. Even now, standing face to face with armed law enforcement, his malignant narcissism shielded him from reality. He genuinely believed this was a dramatic, desperate romantic gesture. He thought I was there to beg for his affection, unable to live without him. He glanced back at his future father-in-law, offering a smug, reassuring nod as if to say he would handle this minor annoyance. "Are you insane, Paige?" Preston demanded, pitching his voice loud enough to ensure the entire ballroom heard his bravado. He laughed, a harsh, condescending sound that grated against the silence of the room. "You think bringing cops will make me take you back?" He pointed a finger at me, shaking his head in mock pity, performing flawlessly for his captive audience. "Look around you, Paige. Look at where I am. I own a $1.5 million penthouse, and I'm marrying into a dynasty. I am completely out of your league. You need to turn around, walk out those doors, and get some serious psychiatric help before you embarrass yourself any further." I stopped exactly 3 feet away from him. I looked at his smug, arrogant face. I noted the expensive cut of his suit, the flawless styling of his hair, and the utter emptiness behind his eyes. He had built an entire existence on a foundation of lies, manipulating everyone in his path to serve his fragile ego. He thought he was untouchable. He thought his lies would protect him forever. The contrast between Preston's extreme arrogance and his actual destitute reality was breathtaking. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger or bitterness. I maintained an icy, clinical calm that completely unnerved him. His confident smile began to waver just slightly at the corners of his mouth. I simply turned my head and gave a slight nod to the process server standing on my right. The server stepped forward with practiced, ruthless efficiency. He lifted the thick, legally binding stack of foreclosure and eviction documents and pressed them directly into Preston's chest. Preston reflexively brought his hands up to grab the heavy paperwork. He looked down at the documents, his brow furrowing in confusion. The bright red Vanguard Apex Capital logo was stamped clearly across the top page right next to the bold lettering of the immediate seizure order. 3 years ago, when Preston was about to lose the penthouse to the bank, I used the profits from my own successful investments to purchase his defaulted mortgage directly from the lender. Banks often sell bad debt to private equity firms at a discount to clear their books. Vanguard Apex Capital bought the promissory note. "Preston Wilson, you have been formally served by order of the county court," the process server announced, his voice carrying easily across the silent dining room. Preston stared at the papers, his mind desperately trying to reject the mathematical reality of his situation. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and searching, waiting for the punchline of a joke he did not understand. I held his gaze, letting the silence stretch for one agonizing second before I delivered the final fatal blow. My voice rang out clear and cold across the banquet hall, ensuring every single guest heard the absolute destruction of his fraudulent empire. "You don't own a single brick of that penthouse, Preston, and I'm not here for you. I'm here for my property." Preston stared at me, his perfectly styled hair suddenly looking ridiculous above his slack, gaping jaw. The heavy legal documents trembled in his manicured hands. I took a deliberate step forward, projecting my voice so that it carried easily to the furthest corners of the opulent ballroom. I wanted the men in their custom tuxedos and the women in their designer gowns to hear every single syllable of his undoing. "3 years ago, you completely bankrupted yourself," I announced, the acoustics of the vaulted ceiling amplifying the cold truth. "You secretly funneled all of your liquid assets into highly leveraged, unregulated crypto investments, trying to play the visionary billionaire. You lost absolutely everything. The original bank initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings. They were 48 hours away from physically dragging you out of the lobby and throwing your designer luggage onto the Gold Coast sidewalk." I paused, letting the reality of my words sink into the silent room. Kinsley let out a sharp, choked gasp, her hands flying to cover her mouth. The society guests exchanged shocked, hungry glances, realizing the golden boy of Chicago real estate was a complete fabrication. I stepped in to save you. I continued, my tone clinical and detached. I used my holding company Vanguard Apex Capital to purchase your defaulted promissory note in its entirety. I absorbed the massive toxic debt you created. For 36 months, I have quietly paid the property taxes, the exorbitant homeowner association fees, and the premium maintenance costs for a luxury penthouse you could never afford. I am not your stalker, Preston. I am your landlord. Preston's eyes darted wildly across the first page of the writ of execution. His breath came in short, jagged pants. His mind simply could not bridge the gap between his towering ego and the objective, undeniable failure printed in his hands. "This is a joke," Preston stammered frantically, flipping to the second page. His voice cracked, losing all of its practiced baritone resonance. "You fabricated this. You hired a graphic designer to print fake court orders. This is a complete fraud." Beatrice charged forward from her overturned chair, her face a terrifying shade of crimson. She pointed a sharp, jewel-encrusted finger directly at my face, her aristocratic facade entirely shattered. "Lies!" Beatrice screamed, her voice shrill and unhinged. "She is a bitter, jealous little nobody. She works in a cubicle doing accounting. My son is a real estate tycoon. Arrest her. Someone instruct these fake officers to arrest her immediately for forgery." Beatrice lunged toward me, raising her hands to claw at my face, but she never made it. The lead sheriff stepped smoothly into her path, crossing his arms over his chest. His imposing physical presence stopped her dead in her tracks. He leveled a stern, uncompromising glare at the older woman, silently warning her that any further movement would result in handcuffs. The absolute authenticity of the armed law enforcement officers thoroughly destroyed Beatrice's narrative. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the surgical, precise expression of an architect watching a demolition go exactly according to plan. "Turn to page 4, Preston Y. instructed gently. His trembling fingers fumbled with the thick stack of paper. He stared at the bolded, highlighted section of the commercial note. A bead of sweat dripped down his temple, staining the pristine white collar of his tuxedo shirt. For the past 36 months, Preston had been sending his mortgage checks to an anonymous corporate entity, entirely unaware that he was paying me. I had been his landlord, his safety net, and his sole creditor. I navigated to the active assets folder. I clicked on a subfolder and found the document I was looking for. The file was labeled Preston Promissory Note, PDF. "Your restructured loan contained a balloon payment," I explained, making sure Warren Vance was listening closely from behind the ice sculpture. "A mandatory, non-negotiable lump sum of exactly $500,000 due at the very end of the 36-month term. That term expired this past Tuesday. You received multiple certified warnings from Vanguard Apex. You chose to ignore every single one of them. You arrogantly assumed you could charm your way into a refinancing deal. Instead, you took your last remaining credit line and bought a 6-carat diamond ring for Kinsley. You bought a shiny rock instead of keeping the literal roof over your head." Preston looked up, his face entirely devoid of blood. The absolute terror in his eyes was staggering. "You missed the payment," I stated, bringing the hammer down with finality. "You defaulted. Under strict state commercial property law, missing a balloon payment on a privately held investment note completely strips you of all standard residential protections. I have executed an immediate accelerated foreclosure. The county judge signed the order this morning. You do not have 30 days. You do not have 30 minutes. You are officially evicted. My team is currently changing the locks on the penthouse, and Vanguard Apex Capital has taken immediate physical possession of the asset." Warren Vance had been standing frozen beside the melting swan ice sculpture, clutching the collateral agreement Preston had just signed. The blood drained from his face as the realization hit him with the force of a freight train. The $2 million he desperately needed to appease his shadow lenders and keep himself out of federal prison was tied up in a property that Preston did not own. The collateral document he had just forced Preston to sign was entirely worthless. He had no leverage, he had no liquidity. He was going to federal prison. Warren lunged forward with terrifying speed. He snatched the thick stack of legal documents right out of Preston's shaking hands. Preston yelped, trying to hold on to the papers, but Warren was fueled by pure, unadulterated survival instinct. Warren's bloodshot eyes scanned the top page. He saw the official blue seal of the Cook County Circuit Court. He saw the presiding judge's signature. He saw the undeniable, legally binding proof that Preston Wilson was a completely bankrupt fraud who possessed absolutely zero capital. Warren slowly lowered the papers. The silence in the ballroom was suffocating. Preston tried to offer his slick, practiced smile, raising his hands in a desperate, placating gesture. Warren. I can explain. Preston whimpered, taking a step backward as the older man advanced. It is just a temporary liquidity issue. I can restructure the debt by Monday. Warren did not let him finish the sentence. He dropped the court order onto the marble floor, planted his expensive leather shoes, and threw a massive closed fist directly into Preston's jaw. The sickening crack of bone hitting bone echoed sharply through the crystal chandeliers. Preston's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed onto the polished marble floor like a puppet with its strings severed. The heavy thud of Preston's skull hitting the imported marble sent a shockwave of pure pandemonium through the Oak Brook Country Club. The pristine illusion of high society elegance evaporated in a single second. Beatrice let out a blood-curdling shriek. She threw herself forward, completely abandoning her carefully crafted aristocratic poise. Her manicured hands curled into claws as she launched her entire body weight at Warren Vance. She slammed her fists against his chest, ripping the silk lapels of his custom Italian suit, screaming that he had murdered her perfect son. Warren stumbled backward, throwing his arms up to block her hysterical, flailing strikes. The massive ice swan sculpture beside them teetered dangerously as Warren crashed against the frozen bar, sending a shower of crushed ice across the floor. Preston was terrible with money. He was so focused on maintaining his wealthy image for Kinsley and her socialite friends that he ignored the fine print of his restructured loan. He had a balloon payment, a massive lump sum of $500,000 due at the end of his loan term. That term expired exactly 2 days ago. He missed the payment because he had drained his accounts to purchase Kinsley's diamond engagement ring. The 2 county sheriffs immediately surged forward, their heavy boots echoing sharply across the ballroom. They grabbed Beatrice by the arms, peeling her off the older man and firmly restraining her. She thrashed against their grip, her expensive designer gown twisting around her legs as she continued to shriek obscenities. The 50 elite guests were on their feet, abandoning their Wagyu beef and vintage champagne. Cell phones were pulled out. Camera flashes reflected off the crystal chandeliers. The complete destruction of the Wilson family was being documented in real time by the very society they had tried to impress. I did not flinch. I stood perfectly still amidst the screaming and the flashing cameras, watching the carnage unfold with absolute clinical satisfaction. Warren frantically adjusted his torn suit jacket. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to summon the terrifying corporate shark persona that had ruled the Chicago financial district for decades. He sneered down at Preston's unconscious body, then glared at me, attempting to project an aura of untouchable wealth to the audience of murmuring socialites. This is a pathetic display, Warren spat, his chest heaving as he pointed a trembling finger in my direction. You think you have accomplished something here tonight? You think foreclosing on this fraud means anything to my family? I have more liquid capital in my checking account than you will see in your entire miserable lifetime. I was going to pay off his pathetic little debt anyway, just to keep the wedding on schedule and avoid this exact type of low-class embarrassment. I slowly shifted my gaze from Preston's bleeding face to Warren's violently sweating forehead. A slow, razor-sharp smile curved my lips. And before you think you can just pay off his debt, Warren, let us talk about your trust fund, I said, projecting my voice so every single wealthy guest in the room could hear me perfectly. Kinsley froze. She had dropped to her knees beside Preston, but my words hit her like a physical blow. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. She remembered exactly what I had whispered to her at the bridal shower. Her manicured hands gripped the fabric of her beaded gown as the blood entirely drained from her face. She looked like a ghost trapped under the crystal lights. You see, Warren, I am not just a scorned ex-girlfriend who bought a commercial note. I continued, stepping closer to the head table, the sharp click of my heels commanding the absolute attention of the room. My actual career, the job Beatrice continuously mocked as a low-level cubicle position, is forensic auditing. When my firm handled the recent Sterling mergers and acquisitions data, I had full access to the corporate ledgers. I saw the digital footprints. I tracked the heavily encrypted transfers. I followed the money straight through a labyrinth of offshore shell companies directly to your personal accounts. Warren's jaw went slack. The arrogant, untouchable billionaire was instantly replaced by a trapped, hyperventilating animal. He took a stumbling step backward, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit doors, assessing his escape routes. "You do not have a single dollar in your checking account, Warren," I announced, my voice cutting through the hushed ballroom like a newly sharpened blade. "Kinsley's family is completely broke. The IRS did not just audit you. They froze every single one of your assets on Wednesday morning for massive multi-million-dollar tax evasion. Your offshore accounts are locked. Your shell companies have been seized by federal agents. You are entirely destitute." A collective synchronized gasp echoed through the ballroom. The whispers among the elite guests turned into loud, scandalous exclamations. Beatrice stopped thrashing against the sheriffs. Her jaw dropped open, and she stared at Warren in absolute, uncomprehending horror. Her ticket to the billionaire class had just evaporated before her eyes. I opened the file. The financial software instantly recognized the missed deadline and flagged the account in bright red. A system prompt popped up in the center of my screen. "Initiate foreclosure protocol on defaulted balloon payment." "That is exactly why you dragged Preston behind an ice sculpture tonight," I continued, pointing a sharp finger at the worthless collateral agreement still lying on the marble floor. "That is why you were desperately trying to force him to sign over the deed to the Gold Coast penthouse. You needed to liquidate his real estate assets to secure an emergency bridge loan so you could flee the country before the federal indictments drop on Monday morning." The absolute staggering absurdity of the situation crashed over the entire room. The grand lavish wedding of the decade was nothing but a mutual parasitic scam. The Wilsons had tolerated Kinsley spending money they did not have because they genuinely believed the Vance fortune would permanently elevate them to the highest tier of society and save Preston from ruin. Meanwhile, the Vances were aggressively pushing the marriage forward because they believed Preston's fake real estate empire was their final desperate ticket out of a federal prison sentence. They were two completely bankrupt, fraudulent families, both desperately trying to bleed a stone, completely unaware that the other was entirely broke. They had spent months manipulating each other, fighting for dominance over a kingdom of absolute dirt. Kinsley looked at her father's terrified, guilty face. He could not meet her eyes. He simply stared at the floor, breathing heavily, entirely defeated by the forensic truth. The pristine illusion of her elite, untouchable life shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The realization that she was marrying a bankrupt fraud and that she herself possessed absolutely nothing finally snapped her mind. Kinsley let out a piercing, guttural scream of absolute horror, the sound tearing through the crystal ballroom as the entire faux dynasty collapsed into dust. Kinsley's scream ripped through the remaining silence, shattering the last illusion of decorum in the Astor dining room. The piercing sound echoed off the vaulted ceilings, a raw vocalization of a dynasty completely collapsing. Preston groaned groggily, spitting blood onto the pristine white marble. He tried to push himself up, but his arms trembled and gave out, dropping his face back against the cold stone. Kinsley stared down at the man she thought was her financial savior. She looked at her father, who remained paralyzed by the exposure of his offshore tax evasion and impending federal indictments. Then slowly she raised her left hand. She stared at the massive 6-carat diamond engagement ring, catching the light from the crystal chandeliers. It was the rock Preston had bought with his last remaining credit line, instead of paying the mortgage on the penthouse he did not own. It was a monument to their mutual parasitic deception. In a fit of pure, unadulterated madness, Kinsley clawed at her own finger. She ripped the engagement ring off her chest, heaving as she stood over Preston's bleeding, pathetic form. She hurled the heavy diamond directly at his face. The sharp edge of the stone struck his cheekbone with a loud smack before skittering away across the floor, coming to rest near a spilled glass of vintage champagne. "You are nothing!" Kinsley shrieked, her voice cracking under the weight of her own absolute ruin. "You lied to me! You are a broke, worthless fraud!" The society guests, finally realizing they were currently trespassing on a crime scene involving federal tax evasion and massive bank fraud, began a frantic, panicked exodus. Chairs scraped harshly against the polished floor. Designer silk gowns rustled aggressively as Chicago's elite scrambled toward the heavy oak double doors. They were entirely eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Vance and Wilson families. No one wanted their name associated with a spectacular, highly illegal bankruptcy. I sat in the back of the car watching the city lights pass by the window. Preston had humiliated me in front of 50 people. He had allowed his mother to call me a charity project. He had ordered me out of his home, claiming he paid for a lifestyle that was entirely funded by my silent sacrifices. He believed he was untouchable. I moved my cursor over the prompt. Yes. Beatrice stood trembling near the head table. The two sheriffs had released their grip on her arms now that she had gone entirely limp with shock. Her wide, terrified eyes darted wildly around the rapidly emptying ballroom. She looked at Warren Vance, who was currently being cornered by process servers and security regarding his federal warrants. She looked at Kinsley, who was sobbing hysterically over her ruined, destitute future. Finally, Beatrice looked down at Preston, her golden child, her ticket to the billionaire class. He was bleeding on the floor, officially homeless, stripped of his fake real estate empire and publicly abandoned by his wealthy bride. The entire identity she had constructed for herself was gone. Beatrice pressed a trembling, manicured hand to her chest. She let out a weak, theatrical gasp, her eyes rolling back precisely as she had seen in dramatic soap operas. She collapsed backward entirely, expecting a flurry of concerned waiters, country club managers, and gasping socialites to rush forward and catch her. No one moved. Beatrice hit the carpeted section of the dining room floor with a heavy, undignified thud. She lay there peeking out from beneath her heavily mascaraed eyelids, waiting for someone to rush to her aid and offer her a glass of water. The country club staff actively stepped around her to clear the broken glass. The remaining elite guests ignored her, entirely too busy whispering furiously into their cell phones to spread the gossip. The ultimate arrogant socialite was left entirely invisible on the floor of the club she had worshipped. Across the room, Vanessa watched her mother fake a medical emergency and her brother bleed on the marble. Her face was contorted in sheer, unmanageable panic. The Wilson family name was permanently destroyed. Her own social standing built entirely on Preston's fabricated wealth, and Beatrice's arrogant bragging was incinerated. Vanessa whirled around to face her husband. Isaiah stood a few feet away, his arms crossed casually over his chest, his expression remarkably calm amidst the utter devastation. "Isaiah, do something," Vanessa pleaded, grabbing the lapels of his tailored suit. Her voice was shrill and desperate, entirely expecting his wealth to shield her from the consequences. "Call your lawyers. Call your financial planners. We have to fix this immediately. We have to bail Preston out before the press gets a hold of this story. Buy the penthouse from Paige. Just write the check." Isaiah did not move a single inch. He looked down at his wife's frantic, grasping hands, then slowly reached up and peeled her fingers off his jacket. His eyes were completely cold, entirely devoid of the warmth and patience he had tried to offer her for years. "I warned you," Isaiah said, his voice steady and quiet, effortlessly cutting through Vanessa's rising hysteria. "I warned all of you. I told you that Preston was drowning in his own lies. I told you that treating Paige like garbage would eventually backfire on this family. You chose to ignore me. You chose to mock me at family dinners and protect his narcissistic delusions." "Isaiah, please." Vanessa begged, tears finally spilling over her carefully contoured cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. "You are my husband. You have to help my family." I watched him walk to the center of the room. He tapped his silver spoon against his crystal flute. The low hum of networking and laughter fell completely silent. I smiled, feeling my heart race against my ribs. I prepared myself to look surprised, ready to walk up to him when he called my name in front of everyone. I clicked the button. The system locked the action and generated the legal execution orders. By tomorrow morning, the city would process the official default. Preston wanted me out of his life, but he had no idea I was the one who owned the penthouse he was standing in. I closed the laptop and leaned back against the cold leather seat, finally allowing myself to take one deep breath. The game had completely changed for him now. "I am not sinking with this ship," Isaiah replied clinically, adjusting his cuffs. "My bags are already packed, Vanessa. I saw this coming the exact moment Preston handed out those ridiculous over-the-top wedding invitations. I am filing for divorce tomorrow morning. You and your family can navigate this spectacular bankruptcy entirely on your own." Vanessa gasped, stumbling backward as if he had physically struck her. She covered her mouth, sobbing uncontrollably as her own marriage dissolved right alongside her brother's fraudulent empire. Isaiah did not offer her a second glance. He turned his attention directly to me. He held my gaze for a long, quiet moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. He offered a slow, deeply respectful nod, validating the absolute mastery of the demolition he had just witnessed. Then he turned on his heel and walked calmly out of the Astor dining room, leaving his soon-to-be ex-wife weeping among the wreckage. I stood motionless in the center of the chaos. The process server had already departed. The sheriffs were moving toward Warren to detain him. The room was nearly empty, leaving only the scattered, pathetic debris of a ruined wedding. A wet scraping sound drew my attention downward. Preston was trying to push himself up from the floor. His expensive tuxedo shirt was ruined, stained with blood from his split lip and crushed ice from the melted swan sculpture. His perfectly styled hair hung in wet, limp strands across his sweating forehead. The arrogant, untouchable real estate tycoon was completely gone. He was nothing but a broken, empty shell of a man who had finally been forced to pay the bill. He dragged himself across the polished marble. His movements were slow and agonizing. He left a faint smear of crimson on the pristine white stone as he crawled directly toward my feet. He did not look at Kinsley weeping in the corner. He did not look at his mother faking a heart attack. He looked only at me. Preston reached out with a trembling, blood-stained hand. His fingers weakly grasped the hem of my midnight blue dress. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and filled with absolute desperation. "Paige, please." Preston rasped, his voice breaking into a pathetic sob. 7 years. We had 7 years together. You know me better than anyone. You are the only one who truly understands me. He tightened his grip on my dress, coughing weakly. The audacity of his delusion was still miraculously intact, buried deep beneath his panic. Even now, stripped of every single asset, humiliated in front of the entire city, he genuinely believed he could manipulate his way back into my good graces. He believed the love I once had for him was a weakness he could exploit to save himself from homelessness. "We can fix this," Preston begged, his tears mixing with the blood on his face. "I was wrong. I was so stupid. You are the one I want. You are the only one who matters. Please, Paige, do not throw me out on the street. I love you." I looked down at the man sobbing at my feet. Preston's fingers dug frantically into the heavy midnight blue silk of my dress, leaving smeared crimson fingerprints against the expensive fabric. He was a pathetic broken shell of the arrogant tycoon who had strutted into this ballroom just an hour ago. The confident baritone voice he used to command boardrooms and manipulate women was completely gone, replaced by a high, desperate whine that grated against my ears. Blood from his split lip dripped onto the toes of my heels. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, waiting for me to show a sliver of the blind devotion I had offered him for 7 long years. He genuinely expected me to drop to my knees, cradle his bleeding face, and tell him everything would be all right. The morning sun reflected off the polished mahogany desk in my downtown office. It was barely 8 a.m., but I was already on my 3rd cup of black coffee, my dual monitors glowing with financial charts and property deeds. On the right screen, I had a specific window open, Kinsley's Instagram Live. I felt absolutely nothing. The rage, the betrayal, and the suffocating grief that had consumed me on the night he threw me out of our apartment had entirely vanished. Looking at him now stripped of his stolen wealth and borrowed prestige, I saw exactly what he was. He was an empty vessel, a parasite who fed on the ambition and capital of others. There was no grand confrontation left to be had. There was no explosive screaming match required. The universe had already delivered his exact measure of justice. I slowly reached down and peeled his trembling fingers off the hem of my dress. I did not rush. I did not show an ounce of malice. I treated his hands as if they were a mild inconvenience, brushing them aside with clinical precision. I met his bloodshot, pleading eyes, letting the absolute zero temperature of my gaze freeze the last remaining flicker of hope in his chest. "I do not love you, Preston," I stated, my voice echoing clearly through the ruined banquet hall. "And we are not fixing anything. You made your choice when you threw me away for a fake billionaire. Now you get to live with it." I stood perfectly straight, smoothing the fabric of my dress where his hands had wrinkled it. I delivered my final words with absolute unwavering finality. "Do not contact me again." I turned my back on him. The second I broke eye contact, Preston completely snapped. He let out a feral guttural howl and lunged forward, his hands grasping wildly for my ankles. He never made contact. The two county sheriffs descended on him instantly. They grabbed him by the shoulders, hauling his thrashing, bleeding body off the marble floor. Preston screamed my name, his voice echoing violently off the crystal chandeliers as the officers slammed him against the nearest wall and pulled his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping around his wrists sounded like the final gavel strike of a judge. I did not turn around. I kept my eyes fixed forward, walking straight down the center aisle of the Astor dining room. The heavy oak doors stood open at the end of the hall. As I approached the exit, a new sound pierced the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the country club. The high, wailing shriek of sirens cut through the quiet Chicago night. The sound multiplied, growing louder and more frantic by the second. Red and blue emergency lights began flashing through the grand floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the terrified faces of the remaining elite guests in alternating shades of panic. Federal agents had arrived for Warren Vance. The entire faux dynasty was officially under arrest. I stepped through the heavy doors and out into the crisp, cool evening air, leaving the screaming, the sirens, and the shattered illusions completely behind me. For the first time in 7 years, I could finally breathe. 6 months later, the opulent world Preston and Beatrice had violently clung to was nothing but a humiliating memory. Preston currently wore a stiff, scratchy polyester polo shirt, bearing the logo of a discount electronics retailer. He spent his days standing under harsh fluorescent lights, organizing cables, and being routinely berated by angry customers over expired warranties. His custom-tailored Italian suits had been seized by bankruptcy courts. The keys to his luxury vehicles were gone. Every night after completing his miserable minimum wage shift, he took 2 separate city buses back to the cramped, mildew-scented basement of his mother's new rental property. Beatrice had suffered an equally spectacular fall from grace. She was a total social pariah. The elite country club members she had worshipped immediately blacklisted her the morning after the wedding implosion. Her phone numbers were blocked, her invitations vanished. When she walked down the aisles of the local discount grocery store, women she once called friends would actively turn their shopping carts around to avoid making eye contact with her. She spent her evenings sitting alone in a cheap faux leather recliner, drinking boxed wine, and staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper permanently exiled from the high society she had sold her soul to impress. I stood thousands of feet above them, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my newly renovated corner office. The Chicago skyline stretched out before me, a breathtaking expanse of steel glass and limitless potential. The Vanguard Apex Capital logo was proudly etched in frosted glass on the double doors behind me. My firm had not just survived the fallout of Preston's betrayal. We had aggressively expanded, absorbing the vacuum left by Warren Vance's federally mandated liquidation. Isaiah sat across from my mahogany desk, looking immaculate in a charcoal suit. He casually rolled out a massive sheet of architectural blueprints across the polished wood. Following his swift and decisive divorce from Vanessa, Isaiah had officially partnered his elite architectural firm with Vanguard Apex. We were currently developing a massive commercial high-rise right in the center of the financial district. Our professional partnership was entirely built on mutual respect, ruthless efficiency, and the shared quiet understanding of having survived a toxic parasitic family. I turned away from the window and walked back to my desk. I picked up my porcelain coffee cup, inhaling the rich, dark roast. I looked at Isaiah, who offered a small, respectful smile as he pointed to the new structural designs. I smiled back. I had lost 7 years of my life to a manipulative fraud, but I had gained an empire in return. I did not just survive the fire they tried to throw me into. I had used the flames to forge an ironclad kingdom. I took a slow sip of my coffee, looking out over the city I now owned completely and entirely untouchable. I leaned back in my leather chair watching the broadcast with calculated amusement. Kinsley was holding her phone high, capturing her perfect, artificially plumped smile while hanging off Preston's arm. They were walking up the sprawling cobblestone driveway of the Chicago Botanical Estate, a historic, ultra-exclusive property that catered only to the city's highest echelon. "Good morning, followers," Kinsley cooed into the camera, her massive new diamond flashing in the sunlight. "Preston and I are doing our final walkthrough at the estate. We just secured this entire property for our wedding next month. It was a cool $200,000 just to rent the grounds, but my amazing fiancé insists on nothing but the best." Preston leaned into the frame wearing a tailored suit that I had paid for 2 years ago. He flashed his signature arrogant grin. "Only the best for my future wife. When you work hard and build an empire, you get to enjoy the rewards. We are turning this place into a fairy tale." I took a slow sip of my coffee. The sheer delusion was almost fascinating to witness. Preston had not paid a single dime for that venue. He had leveraged his completely maxed-out credit lines, assuming Kinsley's father would foot the final bill. But that did not matter anymore. The contract was about to become entirely worthless. On the screen, Preston and Kinsley approached the massive wrought iron gates that marked the entrance to the estate's private gardens. Typically, the gates would be wide open to welcome high-paying clients. Today, they were chained shut. Standing directly in front of the heavy iron bars was the venue's senior manager, a stern-looking man named Mr. Harrison. Flanking him on either side were two burly security guards in dark suits, their arms crossed firmly over their chests. Kinsley kept the camera rolling, oblivious to the tension. "Oh, look, the staff is out here to greet us. Open the gates, please. We have a meeting with the caterers in the Grand Hall." Mr. Harrison did not move. He adjusted his glasses and looked at Preston with professional detachment. "Mr. Sterling, Miss Vance, I am afraid I must ask you to step off the property." Preston laughed a harsh, dismissive sound. "Excuse me, do you know who we are? We are your biggest clients this season. We dropped 200 grand on this place. Open the gates before I call the owner and have you fired." "That will not be possible, Mr. Sterling," the manager replied, his voice projecting clearly over the live broadcast. The Chicago Botanical Estate was acquired in a private corporate buyout at midnight. The new ownership group has exercised the immediate termination clause in your rental agreement. Your contract is officially void. A full refund is currently being processed to your original payment method. But Preston did not look at me. He did not even glance in my direction. Instead, he reached his hand into the front row of the crowd and pulled Kinsley up to stand beside him. Kinsley was 26 years old, the heir to a supposedly massive real estate fortune dripping in diamonds that caught the chandelier light. Preston wrapped his arm tightly around her waist, kissed her cheek, and proudly announced to the entire room that they were officially engaged and getting married next month. I watched Preston's face drain of color on the live stream. His jaw tightened and the arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by an ugly bubbling rage. His fragile ego was being threatened in front of Kinsley and thousands of her followers. "You cannot do that," Preston shouted, stepping aggressively toward the security guards. "We have a legally binding contract. I am a highly influential commercial real estate developer in this city. My firm handles multi-million-dollar buyouts every single week. You do not just cancel on someone of my financial caliber. I demand to speak to the new owner right now. Get them on the phone. Kinsley chimed in, her voice shrill and panicked. Preston, tell them who my father is. Tell them we will sue this place into the ground. My wedding is going to be perfect. Mr. Harrison remained completely unfazed by their tantrum. He looked directly into Kinsley's camera, then back to Preston. The new owner anticipated your displeasure, Mr. Sterling. They left a very specific message for you regarding the termination of your event. And what exactly is that? Preston spat out his face, turning a dangerous shade of red. The manager delivered the line with devastating precision. The owner explicitly stated that trash is no longer permitted on the premises. Kinsley gasped loudly. The camera shook violently as she nearly dropped her phone. The live chat on her broadcast exploded with shocked comments and laughing emojis. The illusion of their untouchable wealth and prestige was shattering in real time for everyone to see. "Turn that thing off!" Preston roared, slapping his hand over Kinsley's phone lens. The Instagram live feed went abruptly black and my office monitor returned to my financial dashboards. I smiled, setting my coffee mug down on the desk. The first domino had officially fallen. While the live stream was dead, I knew exactly what was happening on the other side of those gates. I had meticulously planned every second of this operation. Right at that exact moment, Preston's phone would be vibrating in his pocket. The automated cancellation notice from the venue's legal department had been scheduled to send the instant Mr. Harrison delivered the news. I pictured Preston standing on the cobblestones, furious and humiliated, pulling his phone from his pocket. He would open his email, his hands shaking with rage, ready to find out the name of the holding company that had dared to insult him and cancel his lavish wedding. He would scroll past the legal jargon, past the refund processing details, straight to the corporate signature at the bottom of the rejection letter. He would read the name once. He would read it twice. And then the cold, suffocating realization would finally hit him. The estate was now the sole property of Vanguard Apex Capital. It was the exact same corporate entity that held the defaulted promissory note on his luxury penthouse. The exact same company he had blindly sent his mortgage checks to for 3 years. The phantom creditor he had ignored just yesterday when he missed his massive $500,000 balloon payment. Preston believed he was a master of high finance, a real estate mogul untouchable by the rules that governed regular people. But he was about to learn that true power does not announce itself with flashy Instagram videos or loud declarations of wealth. True power moves silently. It controls the paper, the contracts, and the leverage. He had told me to get my cheap clothes out of his penthouse. He had told me not to contact him again. He had arrogantly assumed I was just a working-class accountant who would quietly disappear into the background while he married into high society. I opened my email client and drafted a quick message to my lead attorney. The applause was deafening. People cheered and raised their glasses in celebration. I stood completely frozen in the back of the room. The air felt like it had been sucked out of my lungs. My feet felt glued to the expensive hardwood floor. I could not comprehend what was happening right in front of my eyes. The venue cancellation was executed perfectly. Prepare the legal notices for the next phase. Preston thinks he can just bounce back from this little setback and rely on his firm to save him. Let us make sure he receives a very special visitor at my office building later today. Less than 2 hours after I sent that email, the heavy glass doors of the Vanguard Apex building practically blew off their hinges. The lobby of my corporate headquarters was designed to be entirely unassuming from the street level. I valued discretion over flashy displays of wealth. However, the interior was a masterpiece of impeccable professional design, featuring polished slate floors, brushed steel architectural accents, and a highly trained, discreet security team. At that exact moment, Isaiah was standing near the reception console. At 34, Isaiah was a brilliant structural architect and a man of uncompromising personal ethics. Unfortunately for him, he was also married to Preston's sister, Vanessa. Isaiah was dropping off the finalized blueprints for a massive commercial renovation project that Vanguard Apex Capital was funding. He was African American, tall, always sharply dressed in perfectly tailored slacks and a crisp button-down shirt, and he possessed a quiet, observant intelligence that the rest of Preston's family entirely lacked. I had always respected Isaiah. He was fundamentally too good for Vanessa and her toxic relatives, but that was his burden to bear. I was standing on the mezzanine level overlooking the main lobby, holding a secure tablet displaying the building's daily financial reports, when Preston and Kinsley stormed through the front entrance. Preston's face was flushed, an ugly mottled shade of purple. He looked completely unhinged. His designer suit jacket flapped open as he marched aggressively past the front desk, deliberately ignoring the security guard's firm request for identification and visitor sign in. Kinsley trailed right behind him, clutching her exotic crocodile skin handbag like a weapon, her designer heels clicking frantically against the slate tiles. "Where is she?" Preston bellowed, his voice echoing harshly off the high ceilings, and causing several of my senior analysts to pause their work. "Where is the little accountant who thinks she can sabotage my life?" Isaiah turned away from the reception desk, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "Preston, what are you doing here?" he asked, stepping forward to intercept his brother-in-law. Preston brushed aggressively past him, shoving his shoulder out of the way. "Stay out of this, Isaiah. This does not concern you. I am here to handle a pest." Isaiah, noticing the absolute unrestrained rage radiating from Preston, did not leave the building as he originally planned. Instead, he crossed his arms over his chest and stood back to watch the scene unfold. His analytical architectural mind was silently evaluating the structural collapse of Preston's composure. He had watched me support Preston for 7 years, and though he never knew the exact financial figures, he knew the truth of our dynamic. I did not hide in my office. I did not call security to drag them out immediately. I simply walked down the floating glass staircase, my heels making a deliberate measured sound that commanded the immediate attention of every single person in the room. I stopped on the final step, looking down at the two of them with absolute detachment. I wore a tailored midnight blue executive suit that projected total undeniable authority. "You are trespassing, Preston." I stated, my voice calm and completely devoid of the emotional hysterics he was clearly expecting to face. Preston pointed a shaking accusatory finger directly at my face. "You tipped them off. Do not stand there and play innocent with me, Paige. You used your little corporate accounting connections to find out exactly who bought the botanical estate overnight. Then you called in a favor to have them cancel my contract out of pure, bitter spite. You are jealous because I am marrying a woman of actual status, and you are trying to ruin the most important day of my life." That is when Beatrice Preston's mother leaned over to me. She had been standing nearby the entire time, waiting for this exact moment. Her heavy perfume was suffocating. She smirked, her voice cutting clearly over the loud applause of the crowd. He was genuinely convinced I was just a petty, broken ex-girlfriend, pulling minor strings from a rented cubicle. His massive arrogance completely blinded him to any other logical possibility. Kinsley pushed her way in front of Preston, positioning herself as the fierce defender of their fake empire. She looked me up and down, her lip curling in a textbook display of manufactured superiority. She reached into her expensive designer bag, pulled out a gold-embossed checkbook, and furiously scribbled on it with a heavy pen. She ripped the check out of the binding and threw it forcefully onto the polished reception desk. It fluttered in the air and landed inches from my hand. I glanced briefly at the amount written across the paper. $10,000. "Take this handout and stop crying to your little office friends to ruin our venue," Kinsley sneered, her voice shrill enough to shatter the glass walls surrounding us. 7 years of leeching off my fiancé is enough. You took his money, you lived rent-free in his luxury penthouse, and now you are throwing a childish tantrum because he finally upgraded to someone in his own tax bracket. Buy yourself a decent wardrobe and disappear. We are done dealing with your peasant drama." I looked over at Isaiah. He was staring intently at the check, then at Kinsley, and finally at me. He knew exactly how much I had sacrificed for Preston over the years. He knew the narrative Beatrice and Preston sold the family was heavily skewed, but watching Kinsley actively rewrite history right in front of him made his jaw tighten with visible disgust. He remained silent, but the gears in his intelligent head were rapidly turning, piecing together the massive lies his in-laws had been telling. I did not touch the check. I did not even look at it again. I maintained steady, unblinking eye contact with Kinsley until she shifted uncomfortably on her feet, intimidated by the sheer lack of emotion in my gaze. Then I turned my attention directly to the reception desk intercom. I pressed the silver button. "Security, escort these trespassers off my property." Preston threw his head back and laughed loudly. It was a grating, desperate sound that bounced off the lobby walls. "Your property? Are you completely delusional? You rent a tiny cubicle in a shared office space. You are a glorified calculator page. You do not own anything. You are nothing without me." I took a slow, deliberate step down onto the main floor. The sheer force of my composure made Preston stop laughing instantly. The silence in the lobby was absolute. Every employee, every security guard, and Isaiah all watched me intently, waiting for my response. "I own the building, Preston," I said, my voice ringing with undeniable certainty. I let the words sink into the quiet air as the blood slowly began to drain from his face. "Every brick, every glass pane, every cubicle. Vanguard Apex Capital is my company, just like I own the botanical estate you tried to rent this morning." The silence in the lobby was absolute. Preston stared at me, his mouth slightly open, his brain visibly struggling to process a reality that completely shattered his fragile ego. Kinsley looked back and forth between us, her hand dropping awkwardly from where she had just thrown the $10,000 check. I stepped closer, keeping my voice level and authoritative, letting the acoustics of the grand lobby carry every single word. "Vanguard Apex Capital manages over $80 million in commercial assets across the Midwest, Preston. I started the limited liability company 5 years ago, right around the time you were crying on your couch because your highly leveraged commercial flips went bankrupt and you could not afford your car payment. I took my salary, the one your mother called a charity project, and I invested it. I bought distressed properties, I executed aggressive corporate buyouts, and I acquired equity in prime real estate all over Chicago, including this specific building, including the botanical estate you tried to rent this morning. I am the sole owner, the sole managing director, and the only person who dictates what happens within these walls." He finally found someone of his own caliber, Paige. Beatrice sneered, her eyes raking up and down my dress with absolute disgust. 7 years was a long charity project, but a working-class accountant like you was never going to wear a ring from this family. Kinsley brings actual value to the table. She comes from a real family. You were just a placeholder until he found his equal. Off to the side, Isaiah shifted his weight. I could see the exact moment the truth clicked into place behind his dark, intelligent eyes. As a highly successful structural architect who frequently dealt with elite commercial developers, Isaiah understood exactly what kind of capital strategy and ruthless intelligence it took to build a portfolio like Vanguard Apex. He had spent the last 7 years listening to Beatrice and Preston spin a pathetic narrative about me at every family dinner. They had convinced the entire family that I was a desperate working-class girl clinging to Preston for a taste of the good life. They claimed Preston was the financial genius carrying my dead weight. Now Isaiah was looking at me in my tailored midnight blue suit, standing in the center of a corporate headquarters I owned, entirely realizing the family narrative was a massive, calculated lie. I had not been leeching off Preston. I had been subsidizing his fake tycoon lifestyle while quietly building an actual legally sound empire of my own. Isaiah let out a low breath, shaking his head slightly in disgust as he stared at his brother-in-law. The sheer level of deception Preston had maintained was staggering, and Isaiah, a man built on ethics and structural integrity, looked absolutely repulsed by the flimsy foundation of Preston's life. Preston suddenly scoffed, a loud, ugly sound designed to project a confidence he clearly did not feel. The color rushed back into his face, driven by pure defensive rage. His extreme narcissism simply refused to accept the facts presented to him. In his mind, it was mathematically impossible for a woman he deemed beneath him to outsmart and out-earn him. "You are absolutely out of your mind," Preston sneered, stepping aggressively into my personal space. "You think you can just stand here and invent some corporate fairy tale to save face? You are an accountant, Paige. You look at spreadsheets for a living. There is no way you built an $80 million fund on your own. Who is the actual financial backer? Which billionaire are you sleeping with to get your name listed on these corporate registration documents? Kinsley immediately latched onto his delusion, her face twisting into a nasty, relieved smile. Of course. That makes perfect sense. She found some rich old man to bankroll her pathetic revenge fantasy. How incredibly sad. You really thought you could pull off playing a chief executive officer today and intimidate us. You are just a glorified mistress with a fake corporate title. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to defend my integrity against their pathetic misogynistic accusations. Their desperate need to invent a fictional sugar daddy to explain my success only proved how deeply I had wounded them. I simply stared at Preston, letting the heavy, suffocating silence highlight his deep insecurities. Preston puffed out his chest aggressively, adjusting his suit jacket as he desperately tried to reclaim the upper hand in front of the lobby staff. Enjoy your little real estate tricks, Paige. Have fun playing pretend with whoever is actually funding this shell company. Because it does not matter. You are still absolutely nothing compared to what I am building. He pointed a shaking finger at the slate floor between us. Next week, my firm is finalizing a $50 million corporate merger to buy out the Sterling Commercial Complex. I am the lead associate managing the acquisition data. My equity cut alone is going to make me a millionaire 10 times over. I'm going to have more liquid cash than your little fake company could ever dream of holding. Preston leaned in close, his voice dripping with venom. And when that massive commission check clears, do you know what? The very first thing I am going to do is I am going to buy this mediocre office building right out from under whoever you are sleeping with. I am going to buy this property, and I am going to personally walk up those glass stairs and fire you. I will tear your pathetic little cubicle down to the studs just for the fun of it. He grabbed Kinsley tightly by the arm, spinning around to march toward the glass exit doors. Keep the 10 grand, Page, he threw over his shoulder, his voice echoing loudly. Consider it a severance package for your wasted time. I did not cry. I did not scream or throw my drink. My analytical brain simply processed the absolute audacity of her statement. Charity project. For the entirety of my early 20s, I had paid Preston's rent. I bought his groceries. I funded his endless networking dinners and country club fees, while he supposedly built his commercial real estate startup. I worked grueling 80-hour weeks analyzing financial data, tracking corporate acquisitions, and managing risk portfolios just to keep the lights on, so Preston could play the role of a successful entrepreneur. He built his entire luxury lifestyle on my dime. I subsidized his fake empire with my hard-earned salary. And Beatrice had the nerve to look me in the eye and call me a charity project. The heavy doors swung shut behind them, leaving a tense, charged silence in the lobby. Isaiah stood there for a moment longer. He did not say a word to me, but he gave me a single, deeply respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement of the absolute truth he had just witnessed before turning and quietly exiting the building to return to his own architectural firm. I stood in the center of the lobby, completely unbothered by Preston's explosive threats. The $50 million Sterling Complex buyout was notorious in the Chicago financial sector, a highly leveraged deal relying on pristine asset valuations. Preston thought he had just played his winning hand. He thought he had intimidated me. I turned to my executive assistant, who was standing wide-eyed near the reception desk, clutching a stack of morning reports. Cancel my 11 o'clock conference call. I instructed, my voice sharp, calm, and entirely focused on the numbers. And log into the corporate database immediately. Bring me the complete merger and acquisition files for the Sterling Commercial Complex. It is time to meticulously review the buyer's financials. The crisp sound of heavy cardstock turning echoed through the silent glass-walled boardroom. I smoothed my hand over the first page of the $50 million proposal, letting my eyes flick upward to meet Preston's terrified gaze. He was sweating profusely. The arrogant smirk he had worn just minutes ago had completely dissolved, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated panic of a man who suddenly realized he was standing on a trap door. Let us look closely at the rent rolls for the Sterling Commercial Complex. I began, my voice projecting with cool, clinical precision. According to the official documents your firm submitted for this merger, the complex is operating at a 95% occupancy rate with premium long-term corporate tenants. You projected an annual yield that theoretically justifies a $50 million acquisition. I tapped a button on my remote, and the massive projector screen behind me lit up with a totally different spreadsheet. These are the real numbers. Preston swallowed hard, tugging nervously at the collar of his tailored shirt. I watched his Adam's apple bob as he stared at the data. Unfortunately for you, Preston, forensic auditing requires looking past glossy brochures and fabricated profit margins. I continued seamlessly. I cross-referenced your submitted rent rolls with municipal tax filings, utility consumption reports, and secondary shell company registrations. 50% of these supposedly premium tenants do not actually exist. They are ghost entities. They are shell corporations registered to empty post office boxes, funneling micropayments back and forth to create the illusion of legitimate cash flow. That is a complete misinterpretation of the data. Preston stammered, his voice cracking slightly as he looked desperately toward his CEO. We use a tiered leasing structure to incentivize early adopters. It is a standard industry practice for commercial acquisitions. Standard industry practice does not include inflating your asset evaluations by exactly 400%. I countered immediately, pulling a secondary file from the portfolio and sliding it down the table. You claimed the structural integrity of the West Wing had been fully modernized. I pulled the actual contractor invoices from the city permit office. You spent $50,000 on cosmetic paint and cheap drywall to cover up foundational water damage that will cost the new buyer $10 million to fix. You completely fabricated the net operating income. You manipulated the debt service coverage ratio to secure initial financing. This is not a lucrative commercial asset, Preston. This is a toxic liability dressed up in fraudulent paperwork. Beatrice slammed her hands flat on the polished mahogany table, the loud smack making several executives flinch in their high-backed chairs. She could not comprehend the complex financial data flashing on the screen, but she understood perfectly that her golden child was being systematically dismantled in front of the most important men in the city. I placed my full champagne glass on the nearest waiter's tray. I did not throw a tantrum. I simply turned on my heel to leave the room. Preston caught my eye from across the crowd. He immediately dropped Kinsley's hand and pushed his way through the guests. He grabbed my arm just as I reached the heavy mahogany doors, dragging me aggressively into the dim, quiet hallway outside the dining room. "This is an absolute outrage!" Beatrice screamed, her face flushed an angry mottled red beneath her heavy makeup. She is lying. Every single word out of her mouth is a vindictive, calculated lie. She is just a bitter, jealous ex-girlfriend trying to sabotage my son's business because he finally realized she was holding him back. She is trying to ruin him because he chose Kinsley. Kinsley comes from a real family with real money. You cannot listen to this working-class nobody. She has no authority here. I did not raise my voice. I did not break my professional composure. I simply closed the heavy leather portfolio and fixed my gaze entirely on her. "Remember when you said my public university degree was not fit to balance your checkbook?" "Beatrice," I asked, the absolute stillness in my voice, cutting sharply through her hysterical screaming. "Well, this public university graduate just caught your son committing federal wire fraud." Beatrice's mouth snapped shut instantly. She collapsed back into her expensive leather chair as if the air had been physically punched out of her lungs. The silence in the boardroom was heavy and suffocating. I turned my attention directly to the CEO of the Sterling Group. The older man was gripping the armrests of his chair, his knuckles entirely white, his breathing shallow. "On behalf of the purchasing group, I am formally denying this merger," I stated, my tone devoid of any sympathy. "The financial disclosures are catastrophically fraudulent. Proceeding with this acquisition would not only be a terrible financial decision, it would make you complicit in a severe criminal act." I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. I slid it firmly across the long mahogany table. It glided smoothly over the polished wood and came to a stop directly in front of Preston's trembling hands. "What is this?" Preston whispered, staring at the envelope like it was a live explosive device. "That is a copy of the official violation report I am filing with the Securities and Exchange Commission at the end of business today," I explained. "You did not just try to fool a private buyer, Preston. You falsified federally regulated financial documents to secure initial funding from commercial banks. You crossed the line from aggressive sales tactics straight into a federal crime. The SEC does not care about your high society connections or your mother's country club status. They care about paper trails, and yours is incredibly sloppy." The CEO of Preston's firm stood up so fast, his chair crashed backward into the thick glass wall behind him. His face had turned a deep, furious shade of purple. He was a man who had spent 40 years building a pristine, untouchable corporate reputation, and he had just realized his arrogant lead associate was about to drag his entire firm into a massive federal investigation. "You arrogant, reckless fool," the CEO roared, pointing a trembling, furious finger directly at Preston. "You lied to the acquisition committee. You submitted falsified financial data under our corporate letterhead. You have completely jeopardized this entire firm and the livelihood of everyone in this building." "Sir, please, I can explain everything." Preston begged, his voice high and thin with absolute terror. "I just needed to inflate the early projections to get the deal across the finish line. I was going to fix the margins after the buyout was completed. We can bury this. We can fix the numbers." "You are fired!" the CEO bellowed, his voice shaking with absolute unrestrained rage. "Effective immediately. You are stripped of your title, your equity, your bonuses, and your access to this building. Security is packing your desk into a cardboard box right now. If the SEC comes knocking at our doors, we will hand them every single email, memo, and document you ever touched. We will cooperate fully with their investigation to save this firm. Get out of my sight before I call the police and have you arrested for fraud myself."